You can try your first 30 days for free of the Herb Rally Schoolhouse at herbrally.com/schoolhouse and just enter coupon code PODCAST at checkout. We release epic new video classes each week. We're building a growing library of diverse herbal education in video, audio, and written form, co-created with some of the most experienced and highly esteemed herbalists around. One more time, to learn more, head to herbrally.com/schoolhouse. And don't forget to use coupon code PODCAST at checkout to try your first 30 days for free. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into the show. The content in this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to cure, diagnose, treat, or prevent any disease. This information has not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. We are not doctors, nor do we play one on the internet. Please seek advice from a qualified healthcare professional. Okay, MC Calico, take it away.
Yeah. Smoking herbal blends. We need some Mullen and some Kush, my brethren. While listening to Herb Rally podcast again. Herbalism at its finest with Mason Hutchinson. Yeah.
Hi there again. This is Lindsay Kolasa. I'm a community herbalist and I live in Santa Barbara, California. And I have posted a couple podcasts here on Herb Rally, one on herbs for postpartum support and another outlining a mastitis case study using herbs. So check that out when you get a chance. Today's podcast will be on herbal alteratives. A friend of mine is a farmer in Mississippi, which is actually where I was practicing and living not too long ago. I just moved back out to California in April of this year, 2018. But a friend of mine farms, and he's got this great homestead outside of Jackson, Mississippi, and he was asking me what herbs could he cultivate, and I thought about it for a while, and the ones that came to me the quickest and the ones that I think we need more of in general are these herbal alteratives. They're typically easy to grow. A lot of them would be considered weeds, probably most of them, and they're so needed. For example, for whatever reason, red clover blossoms are pretty pricey and sometimes hard to find. They sell out. Nettles is starting to sell out from reliable vendors as well. So I encouraged him to start growing some of these alterative herbs. So the ones I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to kind of brush over a few, but the main ones will be red clover, nettles, and burdock. They are probably my favorite, and I'm really not sure why, but I've always gravitated to one of them. And I've always grown nettles, I've always wild harvested red clover, and then my farmer friend I just mentioned grew burdock for me. I grew it a couple years, but he always had nice, large, amazing roots, so I went with what he grew. Okay, so first of all, what are herbal alteratives? So the old timers would have called these herbs blood cleansers. I'll name some real quick. More than red clover, nettles, and burdock, there's cleavers, mullein, plantain, dandelion, calendula, chickweed, echinacea. Those are some more examples. So the old timers would call these blood cleansers or blood purifiers. So some would say, oh, that's an incorrect definition. But I think if you're in a pinch and you need a good elevator pitch, that's a good way to describe it, blood cleanser. But really what's happening is that alteratives are bettering for both cells and tissues of the body, nutrition in, and waste out. So they're really good at removing metabolic waste products, and they're really good at helping assimilation of necessary nutrients and things that the cells and the tissues need to be healthy and robust. So I wouldn't toss out the blood cleanser definition, but there's definitely more to it. I really enjoyed a thread by herbalist Jim McDonald some years ago on Facebook, and he was inquiring and trying to break down the definition of alteratives and get to the root of them. And one of the terms he's come up with them for is metabolic tonics. So he's come up with the term metabolic tonic. Because it basically helps your tissues and cells do their function even better. Or if they're diseased or atrophying, or if there's some compensation, it would help them revitalize and help those cells and tissues function better, so that disease couldn't drive deeper in the body, and also so that health and vitality can return to those tissues. So some other ways to describe alteratives is that they could also be called restoratives. They could be called cleansing tonics. So there are definitely different ways to call these herbs. But one thing that most herbalists agree on is that we call them alteratives. They basically slowly, deeply alter the terrain of the body to welcome in vitality. And if you're from the holistic approach to the body, that is what we're aiming for. We're aiming to return vitality to the tissues of the body. So just like a farmer would tend the soil so that healthy plants would grow. If the soil is rich in nutrition, then plants can grow and they'll thrive. Otherwise, if the soil is depleted, plants will have a hard time thriving and be more susceptible to pests and insect damage and disease in general. So alteratives are great to do the baseline foundational deep work of cultivating a healthy terrain in the body. So some alteratives have an affinity for certain parts, certain tissues in the body. David Hoffman, who's a really well-respected herbalist, will tell you, and many herbalists will tell you, we don't know exactly how alteratives work. We don't know the mechanisms. But the thing is, they do work. And most of them have a deep, deep, deep traditional knowledge and traditional treasure chest of information. Wherever they grow in the native habitat, then within that culture, within that community, you'll find a lot of traditional uses. So back to these alteratives having affinities. So mullein, for example, has an affinity for the lungs. One of my former herb teachers had asthma when she was younger, and mullein, she drank tons of infusion of mullein, so a really long, steeped, strong tea. And one side note on mullein is to make sure to strain it through a coffee filter because it's fuzzy and then it'll actually irritate your throat a little bit. But she was able to get off her inhaler and, transition away from being asthmatic. So that's definitely one case study I've heard of myself. Then there's something like burdock, which has an affinity for the liver, but it also has an affinity for the skin, any kind of skin disorder. And another herb teacher of mine really likes to use it for any kind of reproductive system disorder. So there's just a lot of different herbs, alteratives, that you can use a little more specifically for certain tissues and certain types of tissues and certain organs of the body. So another interesting thing before I talk a little bit about the 3 herbs I mentioned earlier is that out of all the stories I've heard about herbalists and the herbs they use, I recall hearing about 2 different herbalists, 2 different healers. And each of these herbalists used one herb. And I remember this was in the beginning of, my herbal studies when I heard the first story. And I was trying to learn about every herb and cram them all down my throat and, research as much as I could and get out there and try to grow all these different plants and harvest all these different plants. And it was really consumptive. I was very consumptive of herbalism. I mean, I know it's pretty innocent because I was really excited, but, I feel like I was a little overzealous. So when I heard this story about an herbalist, it was a curandera, and this is a healer. It's a healer tradition from Mexico and the Mexican community. It's also in Southwest America. So you can find a lot of traditional curanderas. And this woman, she lived in New Mexico. And basically the story goes that all these different people would come and see her. Someone has a cold, or someone has an ache in their knee, or someone has, a dry scalp. They would just come with all these seemingly different issues. And each time the woman would use the same herb, and she used the root of burdock. And so one day, the woman who told me this story, she actually went to this woman because she was in this town at the time. And she asked her, she was like, how could this be? How could this be that you have all these different people visiting you and you're using the same herb and they're getting better? And the woman just looked at her and she said, burdock and I have a special relationship. I love burdock and burdock loves me. So I just remember hearing that story and just tears welling up in my eyes because it was so sweet, this deep reverence this woman had for this root, and that she also saw the sentience in this root. She saw the intelligence in this root, and that it was able to provide so much for the community.
Hey everyone, it's Mason. Just a quick interruption from the show to let you know about our 13 herbal freebies. If you go to herbalist.com, on the navigation bar at the top of the page, you'll see a button that says Freebies. Just click there and you'll sign up for our email newsletter. And in exchange, we're offering 13 herbal freebies. That's ebooks, webinars, videos, downloadable audio, and discounts to cool herbal companies. So if you'd like to check out these freebies, as well as sign up for our email newsletter, we update you about current events, new monographs, new videos, etc. Just go to herbalist.com and click on the button at the top of the page that simply says Freebies. Okay, that's it from me. Now back to the show.
So the other story I heard about was through my herb teacher in Alabama. She teaches Southern folk medicine. Her name is Phyllis Light, and she's a wonderful teacher. and she has a school there. And she just just offhand started talking about a woman not too far from where she lives in northern Alabama who was always seen out in fields of red clover, harvesting and gathering red clover. She was known as the red clover woman. And that was the only herb she worked with. And people came to see her from far and wide. And they were getting red clover from her. So she was mostly working with a lot of cancer, and she was working with a lot of inflammatory diseases. And of course, that makes sense with red clover. So I'll go more into that later. But I just wanted to tell those stories so you can maybe grasp how powerful, first of all, how common these plants are. They're everywhere, and they're easy to grow. But how deep working these plants are, and how much they can actually resolve, because they work on such a deep level. And actually, a lot of them are anti-inflammatory across a lot of different systems in the body. So that also speaks to probably how they can address so many different issues. Because a lot of health issues, they do stem from inflammation. So anyway, I wanted to tell those two stories because they really stood out to me in my life. And of course, the one herb that they both use, they were alterative herbs. So anyway, I would like to go more into the herbs themselves, the three that I mentioned before. And generally, when taking herbal alteratives, it's a little more common to take them as an infusion, which is steeping the herb in water, either room temp or hot water, for 2 to 6 hours, depending, 2 to 8 hours. It really depends on how long you can wait, really. And decoction would be simmering the plant material. So burdock root, the tougher material, would be better to simmer that. And then something like nettles, I personally would prepare it as an infusion. So just steeping it in water for a long time and then straining out the plant material in both cases and drinking that. So, and typically the dosages were not like a teaspoon or a cup, but a quart a day. So, and they're pretty safe herbs. So you could use it for a few days, or you could use it for weeks. So they do have energetics to them. For example, nettles can be a little drying. So you could balance that out with an herb like oat straw to provide a little more moistening and lessen the effect of the drying aspect of the plant. However, I've been drinking nettles personally for a while for postpartum care, along with some other herbs, including oat straw. And I really, and I already have a bit of a dry constitution. It has not affected me negatively at all. So I haven't felt drier, and no tissues or any mucous membranes of my body have felt that way. My personal experience. So let's go into each of these herbs a little bit. Remember, before I get into the individual herbs, that these alteratives are all about nutrition in and waste out. They're bettering the terrain of the body. They're making it so that disease cannot thrive in your tissues. It has no room and no place in your tissues and in your cells. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of these herbs. So the first one I'll go over, I'll just start with burdock, since that was our original story with the curandera using burdock for almost everything that came through her door. Every person needing some kind of help or support health-wise. So the Latin name is Arctium lapa. There's a lot of different species, but Arctium is the genus, and the species is Lappa, Lappa. So some say not to tincture it because it's a lot less potent, but I've also prepared a tincture, and I find it great in formulas to support the liver and the gallbladder and to support digestion. It is a bitters. It's very mild compared to other bitters. So it's actually got a really earthy, slightly bitter, and some sweet taste to it. As a decoction, meaning simmering it over the stove in some water, it's really got a lovely taste. You could just drink it as a decoction. So, like I said, simmering the plant material in water on the stove, or you can add it to bone broth. So when you're simmering a chicken, or if you're a vegetarian, simmering mushrooms, you can add burdock to add that alterative support. But typically when I'm suggesting someone take an alterative, I like them just to take that one herb so they can really taste it and feel the effect of it. So this wonderful root is used in Asia in quite a bit as a culinary herb as well. So it's a food item, a lot of pickled burdock root. It's great in sautés, so it'll cook just like a carrot. And if you're growing it yourself, you definitely want to harvest it after a year, because otherwise the root gets pretty woody and it's hard to cut up and chop. If you're going to eat it, especially harvest it after that first year. It's a biennial plant, so the second year it'll put out seeds, and that's where it gets its name, its common name, burdock. It has these little burrs that'll stick to your clothes, and you'll help propagate the seeds all over your garden. But yes, it has an affinity for the mucous membranes. So any skin disorder I like to use burdock for. So if there's hives or rashes or eczema, psoriasis, definitely give burdock a try. Even acne, burdock is wonderful. It works on the liver, so it'll help the liver do what it does even better. And in that way, it'll affect the quality of the skin. So most of the time, if someone comes to me and they're having acne or some skin issue, first thing I'll have them do is to start working on the liver with herbs. And burdock is one of my top herbs for that. So burdock is cooling. It's a little moistening. And another herbalist, Phyllis Light, likes to use burdock for any disorder in the reproductive system. So any menstrual disorder, PMS, anywhere where there's inflammation, and there's also an issue with maybe the liver processing hormones. So basically, if the liver's functioning better, then there's a lot of metabolic waste products that will get out of the body, and the body can just function better. So it helps a little bit with bowel production, so processing and breaking down fats. So that really helps. So it's definitely a digestive aid, and it's pretty gentle. So Burdock is just a great herb, and it's tasty, it's super safe, it has a history of culinary use, and it's easy to grow. So it's a wonderful herb to welcome into your world. So the next one is nettles. So this is the genus is Urtica, and the species is Dioica. So this is plant hails from Europe, all across Europe, way into Eastern Europe, way into Asia. Stinging nettles is everywhere. So we do have, and by the way, burdock has naturalized in some areas of the U.S., so you can definitely find it along paths or in fields. You can definitely find it. Stinging nettles, on the other hand, you need to buy the seed and toss it in your backyard and let it start growing. Once a patch develops, it'll be hard to get rid of. But it's a great plant to have, so you won't want to. So we do have a wood nettle. It's a different genus, actually, but it can be used similarly. You can find it in the mountains. I remember when I lived in Western North Carolina, I would gather wood nettle in the spring. So stinging nettles. And yes, the name stinging does imply that it does sting. So underneath the leaves and on the stem, there are these little hairs, and it actually has formic acid. So just like a bee sting or an ant bite, you will get a little nip from that plant. So that's why traditionally it's been used for arthritic conditions, any kind of cold, clammy condition. This is heating, it'll get circulation going, and I'm talking about nettles in its raw state, so it's fresh state. So literally people would roll around in the nettles, or they'd whip their joints, to help with arthritic conditions. Yeah. I mean, one guy I was talking to, his grandmother, where was she from? I can't remember. I think it was Norway, but she would literally roll around naked in stinging nettle. I don't recommend that, but so there's a long historical use of this plant. And what I'm going to be talking about mostly is the dried leaves. So the dried leaf of stinging nettles to be taken as an infusion. So taking the dried herb and drinking, pouring hot water over it and drinking that a quart a day if you can. And I normally let mine steep about 4 hours. You can go a little less and you can go more for sure. But definitely in the case of burdock as well, you want to drink this within 24 hours because it'll start to taste rancid after a while. You can put it in the fridge to extend it a little bit longer, but really, even with refrigerating it, you need to drink it within 24 hours. So nettles. There's tons of nutrients. There's tons of vitamins in nettles. Vitamin C, tons of chlorophyll, naturally occurring electrolytes. So really good for anybody who's doing anything athletic or in a lot of hot sun, and you need to replenish the body. There's a good bit of vitamin K in nettles, so that's why I like this as a, end of the gestation period plant and also a postpartum plant. So an herb to take as an infusion. And because of that vitamin K, it has been known to slow down bleeding a little bit. So it's one herbalist used it to calm intestinal bleeding and even to slow down some uterine bleeding. So I haven't used it personally in that way. Mostly what I've been using nettles for is to rebuild the body after depletion. So all the trace minerals, all the nutrients, all the calcium and magnesium. There's just quite a bit in nettles, and especially when you combine it with oat straw. A lot of calcium and magnesium. and it's a really safe way to ingest calcium and magnesium. I was always taught that, the plants eat the rocks and they eat the minerals, and they break it down and they put it in a form that's easy for us to digest. So we eat plants, and plants have broken down the rocks and the minerals to make it available and easy to assimilate by we humans. So we have this special relationship with plants in that way. So what I've normally used it for, yes, to rebuild the body, and then also nettles are a mast cell stabilizer. So, and they will bring down histamine levels. So I like to use it around any kind of allergic reaction or hay fever, seasonal allergies, even with my little one's teething. I'll combine it with holy basil, which is another great mast cell stabilizer, and plant that reduces histamine levels. Just because one time when she was teething, she got just blotched red on the front of her body and the back, so her chest and her back, and basically because her histamine levels went way up. And she in general has a pretty strong reaction to things in terms of histamine. So I really have been letting her sip on nettles tea just as much as she wants. And I started that around a year old for her. So my in-laws just visited, and they're Ukrainian, and I was telling them that I was drinking nettles, and so they're like, oh, and I described them, and they're like, oh, krapiva, so they told me the Ukrainian word for it, and they said that they couldn't stand the plant because they would always, his father, my husband's father in particular, talked about having to go collect the stinging nettles in the forest, and he's like, oh, my arms always, I was stinging, and, I was so uncomfortable. And he would gather the nettles and let them wilt for a little bit, and they'd chop it up and feed it to the chickens. And just as much of this stuff to the chickens as possible, on top of the bugs and everything else that the chickens were eating. And it totally made sense to me that they did this because, nettles, I think, should be regarded as a superfood in terms of just all the nutrients in nettles. So that was kind of a fun and delightful story, and to see a different angle of nettles. So, so nettles is a really good, great to bring down inflammation, basically just overall throughout the body. And also, I do like to use it it's a good diuretic. So most things, like if I'm looking to combine it with herbs to bring down prostate swelling, or I'm looking to combine it with herbs for the lymph system, I really like that as well. Or I'll put it in a formula for UTIs along with some really strong specific antimicrobial herbs. Like echinacea or usnea for a UTI. So I'll put some nettles in there also to encourage urination, and then just support the tissues of the urinary tract as they revitalize and rebuild. So that's a little bit on nettles, and there's so much more because it has such a deep history. The last one I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to wrap things up here pretty soon, is red clover. So remember how I mentioned the woman in Appalachia out there in fields of red clover collecting it. And I do encourage you to collect red clover. Burdock is pretty inexpensive if you purchase it, as well as nettles. Red clover blossoms can be pretty pricey. So find a patch and go out there and collect. So this is Trifolium pratense. So the species Pratense. So there is crimson clover out there as well, and white clover. Some people I've talked to have said, oh, they use white clover and red clover interchangeably. Red clover, though, Trifolium pratense or pratense, is the official medicinal species. It actually has more of a lavender color, and the crimson clover looks more like a spike, and it's a deeper red. So all over Mississippi where I was, that became like standard in the fields. They've been encouraging farmers to use that as a cover crop. So it ends up a lot by the roadsides as well. And I was telling my farmer friends, I'm like, just do red clover instead. Just throw red clover, because crimson clover, I don't know if it's equivalent, and I don't use it. So I got some of them to switch over. And sometimes it takes the second year for red clover to start blooming. It's in the legume family. It is a nitrogen fixer. It's great for the fields. It has these beautiful lavender blossoms. And those are the ones you want to go out there and harvest. You can just pluck the blossoms in the early summer, I believe, and just lay them out to dry and store them in an airtight jar. So one of my herb teachers, she called red clover, the herbal multivitamin. She just thought it had such a wonderful combination of vitamins and minerals, and she couldn't say enough about it. So herbalist David Hoffman, he wrote a wonderful book called Medical Herbalism. Really good clinical herbalist. He uses red clover for childhood eczema. So safe for children, definitely. And I would say that about pretty much all alteratives. The woman in Appalachia was mainly using red clover for cancer, as I said. So red clover does stop angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels connecting to cancerous tumors. So it's being researched and for stopping the feeding of blood to cancerous tumors. So as well, it works on the lymphatic system. In general, all of these alternatives do, just to one degree or the other. Some are a little more specific, like cleavers or gallium aperine for the lymph. But as I said, it really focuses on nutrition in and waste out. So very reminiscent of the lymph system anyway. So red clover, I would encourage people to drink it as an infusion. So taking it and just pouring hot water over it and drinking that cup or quart of red clover. To do deep work, definitely a quart would be best. And in terms of measurements, 2 inches of herb at the bottom of your quart jar. For red clover, it's fluffier, so I would do a few inches, even 3 or 4 inches, because it'll pack down once you moisten it. So let it steep and then drink that herbal infusion. It's a common cold herb. So it's a great expectorant, helping to loosen up phlegm and move the phlegm out of the system and get that waste debris out of the lungs. So a really common cold herb. And if you're going to use red clover that way, then you'd want to drink it hot. So if you drink it as an infusion, of course, you're letting it steep for 4 to 6 hours. You'll want it to cool down. So red clover definitely has a lot of uses, definitely does deep work, very nutritive plant, and it also has phytoestrogens. So a lot of people can get nervous about estrogens. I mean, we're all nervous about hormones, but and if you want to look more into this, I would encourage you to look up an article by herbalist Juliette Blankespoor. And she's written a blog post called The Ecology of Estrogen. And so in the man-made environment, we have a lot of xenoestrogens, which are from plastics and things like that. They're very violent and aggressive estrogens. And phytoestrogens are very gentle, and they're very, even to some degree, gentler than our own estrogens produced by our body. So phytoestrogens go in and they'll block receptors. They'll fill is a better term, fill receptors with phytoestrogens, and they're very gentle. So in that way, they are filling the receptor, and they block the receptor from the man-made estrogens affecting our hormones and affecting our estrogen levels. So it really is a great idea to take herbs like red clover that have phytoestrogens, and red clover is such a safe and gentle herb, to lessen the effect of these man-made estrogens. So that's another angle on red clover. All right. So this has been a little podcast. We're wrapping up here at around almost 40 minutes. And we've got some information on herbal alteratives, or what the old timers would call blood cleansers. And we've learned about these metabolic tonics and their ability to nourish the body by promoting both assimilation and detoxification. So basically, they're improving our metabolic functions in the body. So feel free to comment below, dig deeper on all these herbs to see what you can discover in both traditional and scientific literature, and explore them, taste them, bring them into your home. They're very safe and very nourishing. And if possible, bring them into your garden. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.
And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Herb Rally podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us here at Herb Rally, we now have a text message community, believe it or not. Basically, it's just updates from us. We send about 1 to 7 texts per week, notifying you about new events, videos, courses, podcasts. You get the idea. It's pretty much like our email newsletter, just in text form. So if you'd like to receive text messages from Herb Rally, just text JOIN, that's JOIN, to the number 541-256-2895. Again, that's JOIN to number 541-256-2895. And to stop receiving texts, that's easy too. Just text STOP to the same number. It'll opt you out immediately. Okay, thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.